The elevator's polished mirrors reflected two worlds colliding at midnight. Thomas's work-worn hands gripping his janitor's cart, while 20 floors below, Manhattan's elite slept in their fortresses of steel and glass. But tonight, something stirred in the penthouse where Victoria Sterling had spent 20 years imprisoned by her own broken body. She watched him through the shadows as he quietly worked around her wheelchair, the same chair that had been her world since the accident that stole her legs. Most visitors, doctors, lawyers, distant relatives, spoke about her as if she weren't there. But this janitor, this stranger, hummed old jazz while carefully dusting her untouched physical therapy equipment. 20 years. She whispered to the darkness after he left, flexing fingers that trembled with a hope she'd forgotten existed. 20 years of everyone telling me what's impossible. What Victoria didn't know was that Thomas had been carrying his own impossibility for just as long. Thomas Watson had learned that survival meant keeping your head down and your expectations lower. At 42, he moved through Sterling Tower's marble corridors like a ghost, invisible to the wealthy tenants who lived in clouds above the city. His uniform bore no name tag, his footsteps made no sound on the polished floors, and his presence disturbed no one's carefully constructed world of privilege. The night shift suited him perfectly. While Manhattan's power brokers slept in their penthouses, Thomas cleaned their messes, emptied their trash, and maintained the illusion of their spotless lives. It was honest work that paid enough to keep his 8-year-old son fed and housed in their cramped Queens apartment. What more could a man like him ask for? But Sterling Tower's top floor had always felt different. For 3 months now, Thomas had cleaned around the woman in the wheelchair. Victoria Sterling, the building's owner and the most untouchable resident of them all. She never spoke to him, never acknowledged his presence, yet something in her stillness suggested she was always watching, always thinking. Tonight was different, though. As Thomas wheeled his cart into the vast penthouse living room, he noticed something that stopped him cold. The physical therapy equipment, those expensive machines that had gathered dust for months, bore fresh fingerprints on their chrome surfaces. Someone had been touching them, testing them, perhaps even using them when no one was watching. Victoria sat in her usual spot by the floor-to-ceiling windows, her silhouette framed against the glittering city below. Her hands rested on her wheelchair's armrests, but Thomas could see the subtle tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers gripped the leather just a little too tightly. She was fighting something, or fighting for something. "You're wondering about the machines?" Victoria's voice cut through the silence like broken glass. Thomas froze, his hand halfway to emptying a wastebasket. In 3 months of cleaning her home, these were the first words she'd ever spoken to him. He turned slowly, meeting her gaze for the first time. Her eyes held the sharp intelligence that had built a real estate empire, but beneath that was something raw and desperate that money couldn't fix. "I'm sorry, Mom. I didn't mean to." "Don't apologize." Victoria's voice was stronger now, more commanding. "You're the only person who works in this building who doesn't look at me like I'm already dead. Do you know what that's worth to someone like me?" Thomas shifted uncomfortably, unsure of the dangerous ground he was stepping onto. In his world, conversations with tenants, especially owners, could cost him his job faster than anything else. But something in Victoria's tone suggested this wasn't really about him at all. "I notice things," he said carefully, resuming his work with deliberate focus. "Part of the job." "What else do you notice?" The question hung in the air between them like a challenge. Thomas considered his words as he wiped down surfaces that were already spotless. "I notice that someone's been using the therapy equipment. I notice that the magazines on your side table aren't in the same order they were last week. I notice that you position your chair differently each night, closer to the window when it's been a bad day, farther away when you're feeling stronger." Victoria was quiet for so long that Thomas wondered if he'd overstepped. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a weight that seemed to fill the enormous room. "My daughter thinks I should sell this place, move somewhere with better facilities for someone in my condition, somewhere I can be properly managed." The word managed fell from her lips like a curse. Thomas understood that feeling, the weight of other people's expectations, the slow suffocation of being defined by your limitations rather than your possibilities. "What do you think?" Thomas asked, the question slipping out before he could stop himself. Victoria's laugh was bitter and sharp. "I think I've spent 20 years letting other people decide what I can and cannot do. I think I'm tired of being a problem that needs solving instead of a person who needs living." Something shifted in the room's atmosphere, like the moment before a storm breaks. Thomas felt it in his chest, that familiar tightness that came when life offered you a choice between safety and something infinitely more dangerous. The following week brought the first real test of whatever fragile connection had formed between them. Thomas arrived for his shift to find Victoria's penthouse in chaos. Medical equipment cluttered the living room, and voices drifted from the bedroom, her daughter's sharp, professional tone cutting through the night air like a blade. "Mother, Dr. Harrison has been very clear about your prognosis. This fantasy of yours about walking again is not only unrealistic, it's dangerous. You're going to hurt yourself, and then what? Who's going to be responsible for that?" Thomas hesitated in the hallway, cart in hand, unsure whether to retreat or announce his presence. The conversation felt too intimate, too raw for an outsider to witness. But then Victoria's voice rose above her daughter's, carrying a strength that hadn't been there the week before. "I'm 48 years old, Caroline. Not 80, not dying, not ready to be warehoused in some facility where they'll pat my hand and tell me how brave I am for accepting my limitations." "You had a spinal cord injury 20 years ago, Mother. The doctors were very clear. The doctors were wrong about a lot of things 20 years ago." Victoria's voice carried a note Thomas had never heard before, hope mixed with desperation, like someone grasping for a lifeline in dark water. "Medical science has advanced. There are new treatments, new possibilities. False hope is cruel, Mother. I won't be part of feeding your delusions." The silence that followed was so complete that Thomas could hear his own heartbeat. When Caroline Sterling Morrison swept past him in the hallway, her Chanel suit and diamond jewelry catching the hallway lights, she barely glanced at the janitor with his cart of cleaning supplies. To her, he was furniture, functional but invisible. Thomas found Victoria where he'd left her the week before, by the windows overlooking the city. But everything about her posture had changed. Her shoulders sagged with defeat, her hands lay limp in her lap, and her gaze seemed focused on something far beyond the glittering lights below. "Tough night," Thomas said quietly, beginning his work around her. "She's not wrong, you know." Victoria's voice was barely above a whisper. "It has been 20 years. Maybe I am chasing false hope. Maybe I should just accept that this is who I am now, who I'll always be." Thomas continued cleaning in silence. But his mind was racing. He thought about his own son, 8-year-old Marcus, and the way the boy's eyes lit up whenever someone told him he could be anything he wanted when he grew up. He thought about the medical bills that kept piling up, the specialists who kept saying there was nothing more they could do, the way hope and despair could live in the same breath. "Can I ask you something?" Thomas said, stopping his work to look directly at Victoria. "When was the last time someone told you that you were capable of something instead of telling you what you couldn't do?" Victoria's laugh was hollow. "I built a real estate empire from nothing. I employed thousands of people. I made decisions that affected millions of dollars and countless lives. But apparently none of that matters when you can't walk to the bathroom by yourself. It all matters," Thomas said quietly. "The question is, what you're going to do with it." That night marked the beginning of something neither of them could have predicted. Thomas started staying later, not because his work required it, but because Victoria had begun talking about her life before the accident. She told him about growing up poor in Brooklyn, about working 3 jobs to put herself through college, about the day she bought her first property with money she'd saved from cleaning offices at night. "Just like you're doing now," she said one evening, and Thomas felt something shift in his understanding of their relationship. "Not quite like me," Thomas replied. "I'm not building an empire. I'm just trying to keep my son healthy and in school." It was the first time he'd mentioned Marcus, and Victoria's sharp business instincts immediately picked up on the pain behind his words. "What's wrong with your son?" Thomas hesitated, then found himself telling her about the rare kidney condition that required constant monitoring and expensive treatments. He told her about the insurance that covered most, but not all of the costs, about the second job he'd taken on weekends, about the way 8-year-old Marcus had stopped asking for toys and started asking if Daddy was okay. "The doctors say he'll need a transplant eventually," Thomas said, his voice barely steady. "They say I'm a match, but the surgery, the recovery time, I can't afford to be out of work that long." Victoria listened without interruption, her business mind already calculating costs and possibilities. But she said nothing that night, and Thomas wondered if he'd revealed too much about his life to someone who lived in a completely different world. The change came gradually, so subtly that Thomas almost missed it at first. Victoria began positioning her wheelchair closer to the physical therapy equipment during his visits. She started asking him questions about his work routine, about the building's other tenants, about anything that would keep him in the room longer. Then one night, as Thomas was preparing to leave, Victoria did something that stopped him cold. She reached for the hand grips on her wheelchair and slowly, carefully, began to pull herself upright. "Mrs. Sterling," Thomas started, but she held up a hand to stop him. 20 years," she said through gritted teeth, her arms shaking with effort. 20 years of everyone telling me to sit down and be grateful for what I have left." She managed to stand for perhaps 10 seconds before sinking back into her chair, breathless but smiling. It was the first real smile Thomas had seen from her, and it transformed her entire face. "I felt my legs," she whispered, wonder filling her voice. "Just for a moment, but I felt them." Thomas stood frozen in the doorway, understanding that he was witnessing something profound and dangerous. If Victoria's daughter found out about this, if the building management discovered that the janitor was encouraging the owner's dangerous delusions, his job would vanish overnight. His son's medical care would disappear with it. But looking at Victoria's face, seeing hope bloom where despair had lived for 2 decades, Thomas made a choice that would change both their lives forever. "Same time tomorrow?" he asked quietly. Victoria's smile grew brighter. Same time tomorrow. What neither of them realized was that Caroline Sterling Morrison had installed security cameras throughout her mother's penthouse the week before, cameras designed to monitor Victoria's episodes and provide evidence for the competency hearing she was quietly arranging. And tonight, those cameras had captured everything. For 2 weeks, their midnight sessions continued in secret. Victoria's progress was slow but undeniable. She could stand for longer periods, take tentative steps while gripping the parallel bars. And most importantly, she had begun to believe in herself again. Thomas found himself arriving earlier and staying later, teaching her the physical therapy techniques he'd learned during his own recovery from a construction accident years before. "You never told me you knew about rehabilitation," Victoria said one evening as Thomas guided her through leg exercises. "You never asked," Thomas replied, adjusting the resistance on the therapy bike. "I spent 6 months in physical therapy after I fell from scaffolding. Learned a lot about what the body can do when you don't give up on it. Victoria studied his face in the dim light. Is that how you hurt your back? I've seen you favor your left side when you think no one's watching. Thomas was quiet for a moment, surprised by her observation. Some injuries never fully heal, but that doesn't mean you stop moving forward. It was exactly the kind of wisdom that Victoria's expensive doctors had never offered her. Practical, hard-earned knowledge from someone who understood what it meant to rebuild yourself from broken pieces. Their conversations had begun to range far beyond physical therapy. Victoria told him about the loneliness of wealth, about how money had insulated her from genuine human connection. Thomas shared stories about raising Marcus alone, about the way his son's laughter could make even the worst days bearable. He wants to be a teacher, Thomas said one night as Victoria practiced standing transitions. Says he wants to help kids learn things their parents can't teach them. Smart boy, Victoria murmured, concentrating on keeping her balance. Takes after his father. The comment hung in the air between them, carrying implications neither was ready to examine too closely. They were from different worlds. She owned buildings, he cleaned them. She made decisions that moved millions. He struggled to pay for his son's medication. Yet in the quiet darkness of her penthouse, with the city spread out below them like a carpet of stars, those differences seemed less important than the connection they'd forged through shared determination and quiet courage. But secrets in buildings like Sterling Tower never stayed hidden for long. Carolyn Sterling Morrison chose a Thursday morning to strike, arriving at her mother's penthouse with her lawyer, Dr. Harrison, and a security expert who'd been monitoring the camera feeds for weeks. Victoria was having breakfast when they burst through the front door, tablets and folders in hand, their faces wearing the grim satisfaction of people who'd been proven right. "Mother, we need to talk," Caroline announced, her voice cutting through the morning quiet like a surgeon's scalpel. "About your nocturnal activities and the liability they pose to this family." Victoria set down her coffee cup with deliberate calm, but Thomas could see her hands trembling slightly. She'd known this moment would come. They both had. But knowing and being ready were entirely different things. "I assume you're referring to my physical therapy sessions," Victoria said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent decades in boardrooms facing down hostile takeovers. "I'm referring to your reckless endangerment of yourself with the assistance of unqualified building staff." Caroline replied, activating a tablet that showed crystal-clear security footage of Victoria attempting to walk. "Dr. Harrison, would you please explain to my mother what could have happened if she'd fallen during one of these episodes?" Dr. Harrison cleared his throat, consulting his notes with the theatrical precision of someone who'd delivered this speech before. "Mrs. Sterling, given your spinal cord injury and the deterioration of muscle mass over 20 years, any fall could result in additional fractures, internal bleeding, or further neurological damage. The risk of permanent paralysis below the neck is significant." Victoria listened without flinching, but Thomas could see the fear flickering in her eyes. For all her newfound confidence, she was still vulnerable to the medical establishment that had defined her limitations for 2 decades. "And as for you..." Carolyn turned her attention to Thomas, who had been standing quietly by the service entrance, hoping to avoid the confrontation entirely. "Your employment is terminated immediately. We have documentation of your inappropriate relationship with a vulnerable tenant, your failure to report potentially dangerous behavior, and your complete violation of building protocols." Thomas felt the words hit him like physical blows. His son's medical care, their apartment, his carefully constructed life. All of it was crumbling because he'd dared to help someone hope for something better. "Wait." Victoria's voice cracked like a whip across the room. "You will not speak to him that way in my home." Caroline's laugh was cold and professional. "Your home?" Mother, you haven't been competent to make decisions about this property for months. The conservatorship papers are already prepared. Dr. Harrison has documented your deteriorating mental state, your dangerous delusions about recovery, and your inappropriate attachment to building staff. The silence that followed was absolute. Thomas watched Victoria's face cycle through emotions: shock, rage, defeat, and finally something else entirely. Something that reminded him of the woman who'd built an empire from nothing, who'd refused to accept anyone else's definition of what was possible. "Caroline," Victoria said quietly, her voice carrying a note that made everyone in the room lean forward slightly. "Do you remember what I told you when you were 12 years old and said you couldn't learn to ride a bicycle because you were afraid of falling?" Caroline frowned, clearly annoyed by the apparent non sequitur. "Mother, this isn't the time for—" "I told you," Victoria continued, her voice growing stronger, "that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's deciding that something else is more important than your fear." She looked directly at Thomas, and he saw 20 years of buried determination blazing in her eyes. "I've been afraid for 20 years, afraid of falling, afraid of failing, afraid of hoping for something I might not achieve. But you know what I'm more afraid of now?" Nobody answered. "I'm afraid of dying without ever really living again. I'm afraid of letting fear make decisions for me for the rest of my life. And I'm afraid of standing by while good people suffer because I was too much of a coward to use the resources I have to help them." Victoria reached for her wheelchair's controls and maneuvered closer to Thomas. "Caroline, I want you to meet someone who's taught me more about courage in the past month than all my expensive doctors have taught me in 20 years. Thomas Watson, single father, works 3 jobs to pay for his son's medical care, and somehow still finds time to believe that a broken-down woman like me might walk again." Thomas felt heat rush to his face as every eye in the room focused on him. This wasn't how he'd wanted to be introduced to Victoria's world, as the object of her charity or the subject of a family drama he'd never asked to be part of. "Mrs. Sterling," he said quietly, "you don't need to—" "Yes, I do," Victoria interrupted. "Because while you've been teaching me to stand up, I've been remembering what I'm capable of when I stop sitting down." She turned back to Caroline, and her voice carried the unmistakable authority of someone who'd just made an irreversible decision. "I'm establishing a medical trust fund for Marcus Watson, full coverage for his kidney condition, including transplant surgery when the time comes. Consider it the first act of my newly recovered mental competence." The room erupted in voices: Caroline's protests, Dr. Harrison's medical objections, the lawyer's legal warnings. But Thomas heard none of it. He was staring at Victoria, understanding that she had just risked everything she had to help a child she'd never met, to help him when he'd never asked for anything except the chance to hope alongside her. "Why?" he managed to ask through the chaos. Victoria's smile was radiant and fierce. "Because 20 years ago I forgot that having money isn't about what you can buy, it's about what you can make possible. And right now, making your son's future possible seems like the most important thing I can do with mine." Caroline was still talking, still threatening, still trying to regain control of the situation, but Victoria had stopped listening. Instead, she was looking at Thomas with an expression he'd never seen before, not gratitude, not pity, but partnership. 2 people who'd found something in each other that the rest of the world had overlooked. "There's one more thing," Victoria said, her voice cutting through Caroline's protests like a blade through silk. "Thomas, I want to offer you a position as my personal rehabilitation coordinator. Full salary, health benefits, and flexible hours so you can spend time with Marcus during his treatment." Thomas felt the world tilt around him. "Mrs. Sterling, I'm not qualified for—" "You're the most qualified person I know," Victoria said firmly. You understand what it means to rebuild yourself when everything seems impossible. You know how to hope when hope seems dangerous. And you're the only person who's ever looked at me and seen possibility instead of limitation." In the stunned silence that followed, Thomas found himself thinking about his son, about Marcus's bright eyes and endless questions, about the medical bills that had been slowly drowning them both, about the future that had seemed so uncertain just moments before. He thought about Victoria's determination, about the courage it had taken for her to stand up in more ways than one, about the strange friendship that had formed between two people who should never have found each other, on one condition, Thomas said quietly. Victoria raised an eyebrow. "Name it." "We do this right. Real physical therapists, proper medical supervision, realistic goals. No more secret midnight sessions that could hurt you." Victoria's laugh was pure joy. "Thomas Watson, you just negotiated with a multimillionaire and won. I think you're more qualified for this job than either of us realized." As Caroline stormed out with her entourage, muttering threats about lawyers and competency hearings, Victoria turned her wheelchair toward the wall of windows overlooking Manhattan. But this time, she wasn't looking at the city with the resigned gaze of someone imprisoned by circumstance. She was looking at it like someone who remembered she had the power to change things, starting with herself. "You know," she said to Thomas as they watched the morning sun paint the city in shades of gold and possibility, "I think this is the beginning of something neither of us saw coming." Thomas nodded, thinking about phone calls he needed to make to Marcus's doctors, about hope he'd been afraid to feel, about the unexpected ways that helping someone else find their strength could help you discover your own. "Mrs. Sterling," he said quietly, "I think you're right." 6 months later, Victoria Sterling took her first independent steps in 20 years across the marble floor of her penthouse, with Thomas Watson steadying her elbow and 8-year-old Marcus Watson cheering from his post-surgery wheelchair nearby. The boy's transplant had been successful, his recovery was ahead of schedule, and his laughter filled the enormous apartment with a sound that money couldn't buy, but determination could earn. Caroline never did file those competency papers. It's hard to argue that someone lacks mental capacity when they've just reorganized their physical therapy program so successfully that it becomes a model for spinal cord rehabilitation centers across the country. Victoria's recovery made headlines, but more importantly, it made hope possible for thousands of others who'd been told their limitations were permanent. Thomas kept his janitor's uniform in his closet, not out of sentimentality, but as a reminder of the night he'd learned that sometimes the most important work you can do is simply being present when someone needs to remember their own strength. His official title was Director of Patient Advocacy for the Sterling Foundation for Spinal Recovery, but his real job remained the same as it had always been, helping people stand up, one step at a time. On quiet evenings, when Marcus was doing homework, and the city sprawled glittering below them, Victoria and Thomas would sit by those same floor-to-ceiling windows where their friendship had begun. Sometimes she walked to the window under her own power. Sometimes she used her chair, but it no longer mattered which. What mattered was that she had choices again, that hope had replaced resignation, and that two people from completely different worlds had discovered that healing often begins when you stop trying to fix yourself alone. "Do you ever regret it?" Victoria asked one evening as they watched the sun set over Manhattan. "Giving up your quiet life for all this chaos?" Thomas considered the question as he watched Marcus explaining his math homework to Victoria with the patience of someone who'd learned that teaching was just another form of caring. "I never had a quiet life," he said finally. "I had a small life. There's a difference." Victoria smiled, understanding exactly what he meant. "And now?" "Now I have a life big enough for hope." Thomas replied, "Turns out that's all any of us really need. enough space for hope and someone who believes it's possible. Outside their window, the city hummed with 8 million individual stories, 8 million private struggles, 8 million people trying to find their way from where they were to where they wanted to be. Most of them would make that journey alone, step by careful step. But some, the fortunate few, would discover what Thomas and Victoria had learned on a midnight floor 20 stories above the street. Sometimes the impossible becomes possible when you're brave enough to stand up and someone else is brave enough to believe you can.